Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Mirowitz Center program today on Women in Art with Dale Sharon, the wonderful docent from the St. Louis Art Museum. I'm going to go ahead and let Dale take this program over for today, and then we would like to, at the end, tell you a little bit more about an upcoming program that she's going to be doing beginning in March. So Dale, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Judy. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. It's really great to see all of you again. I hope you've been staying safe and I guess enjoying the weather a little. Maybe it'll get a little warmer soon. We're getting to that point. I think in the last 2
My
months.
speaker's not working.
Ooh. Somebody can't hear.
No, I think we got that handled, Dale. Go ahead.
Okay. In the last 2 months, we looked at women artists in the St. Louis Art Museum from the Middle Ages until today. And what an impressive group they really were. Painters and sculptors and artists that have made their mark in the world over the centuries. But the artists that we're going to see today are just as impressive. Now, I was going to kind of end this series on women artists last month, but I decided that there were so many more artists who are rarely on view. Most of them are photographers or printmakers, but all are artists with amazing work. Zoom kind of gives us that unique opportunity to meet some of them that we wouldn't ordinarily have. Many of the artists we'll see today, you probably may not have heard of, but artists that after today might become some of your favorites. There are many reasons why a piece of art speaks to us. I mean, even in this cartoon, because it has a bench. But I really think that you might be drawn to some of these artists and would like to experience them up close and personal. So don't forget that if you want to see any of these pieces, call the Prince Drawings and Study Room and make an appointment. They'll be happy to show you any or all of the pieces we're going to talk about this morning. So let's begin with women photographers. Photography captures a point of view, freezing one person's perspective in time forever. Male perspectives, however, have largely been the ones in the foreground, leaving the work of their female peers in the dark, or the dark room, as they say. Today, we'll turn the spotlight on the lesser known but equally remarkable work of women photographers. As Bernice Abbott, an incredible photographer, said, "Photography helps people see." So we'll take a look at the unseen pioneering women behind the camera and some of the greatest women photographers of all time. So quickly, how many women photographers can you name? I would guess that most of us could name only a few, but women have been capturing sensitive and creative images worthy of praise and recognition since the invention of the camera. The participation of women in photography goes back to the very origins of the process. Several of the earliest women photographers were married to male pioneers or had close relationships with their family. It was in Northern Europe, however, that women first entered the business of photography. And it was not until the 1890s that the first studios run by women opened in New York City. Women first photographed as amateurs, several producing fine work, which they were able to exhibit at key exhibitions, such as with Alfred Stieglitz. The involvement of women in photojournalism had its beginnings in the early 1900s, but slowly picked up after World War I and during the Depression. It was in the 60s before women began pursuing photography as a profession in large numbers. The photographs we'll see today tackle a range of subject matter, demonstrating how some women photographers were interested in accurately documenting reality, while others photograph with their hearts, driven by our artistic expression. They really are an amazing bunch. So let's begin with photos from Victorian photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. From her housemaid to Alfred Lord Tennyson, the indomitable Victorian Julia Margaret Cameron wrestled everybody into her studio, dressing them up as characters from Shakespeare and the Bible. By the coercive force of her eccentric personality, she enlisted everyone around her as models, from family members to domestic servants and local residents. The wife of a retired jurist, Cameron moved in the highest circles of Victorian society in England. She photographed the intellectuals and leaders within her circle of family and friends, among them the poet laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson. She derived much of her inspiration from literature, and her work in turn influenced writers. Although she would become one of Victorian Britain's most famous photographers, Julia Margaret Cameron started taking pictures relatively late in life. In 1863, at 48 years old, she received her first camera from one of her 6 children, a gift meant to provide her with a hobby since they were grown. The photographs she made, working at first by trial and error and bossiness, as she absolutely existed, art with a capital A. She ignored the carping of critics who put down her dreamy focus to technical incompetence. For 11 years, Cameron exploded with creativity. She was lucky, a rare Victorian woman whose talent was not entirely suffocated by domestic duties. Of course, she had help. The camera was heavy and there were plenty of chemicals to deal with, and presumably it was the servants who did most of the lugging around. Cameron photographed anyone who would let her. Such local figures as the postman, as well as her own family and servants, appear in many of her images. Her tenacity and eccentricity eventually became well known. She allegedly followed promising-looking people on the streets until they consented to model for her. A well-read, educated woman, she often pressed her subjects into posing for allegorical or historical or literary or biblical scenes, such as in Vivian and Merlin. Vivian and Merlin is an enactment of a passage from Tennyson's epic poem, Idylls of the King. Capturing the moment of betrayal in Tennyson's poem, this image depicts the seductive Vivian casting a spell over the magician Merlin as he falls into a trance. Cameron's husband and her maid posed for the 2 characters in the scene. The photo on the left is one of more than 50 photographic portraits that Cameron made of her niece, Mrs. Herbert Duckworth, who is the mother of novelist Virginia Woolf. Though her photographic processes of the period allowed for more detail, Cameron preferred a soft focus, and this didn't detract from her subject's direct and penetrating gaze. In this photograph, Cameron was able to capture both the outward likeness and a sense of the inward character of her niece. Next, let's look at Margaret Bork White, a pioneering photojournalist whose insightful pictures of 1930s Russia, German industry, and the impact of the Depression and drought in the American Midwest established her reputation. She took some of the first photographs inside German concentration camps at Buchenwald following the end of World War II, and captured the last pictures of Mahatma Gandhi in India. She spent years traveling the world, covering major events from World War II to the partition of India and Pakistan, the Korean War, and much more. Bork White held numerous firsts in her photographic life. She was the first foreign photographer allowed to take pictures of the Soviet industry. She was the first female staff photographer for Life magazine and made its first cover photo. And she was the first woman allowed to work in combat zones in World War II. Bork White opened her first studio in an apartment in Cleveland, Ohio. with photographs of architecture and industry, and she earned commissions and caught the eye of Henry Luce, the founder of Time and Fortune magazines, who in 1929 invited her to become Fortune's first staff photographer. She returned to New York and in 1930 established a studio in the Chrysler Building. When Luce launched Life magazine in 1936, Bork White joined the staff and her photograph appeared on the first cover of Life. In our photograph, massive spherical tanks of toxic gas hover overhead in Margaret Bork White's photograph of German ammonia factory. The tanks dwarf two workers standing on top in a visual metaphor of industrial might. Bork White shot this photograph for a story on German heavy industry in 1930 while on assignment for Fortune magazine. This ammonia factory was operated by IG Farben, Germany's biggest chemical and pharmaceutical manufacturer, and the single largest donor to the Nazi Party's successful 1932 election campaign. Today, her consummate mastery of photography and her humanistic approach to picture making are hallmarks associated with one of the greatest photojournalists of the 20th century. The two photos on the right are examples of her compassion and sensitivity. Not only is Imogen Cunningham known for her photographs, she's often referred to as acidic. Ansel Adams is said of her, "I used to say that Imogen's blood was 3% acidic acid. She seems to have had an acid reaction to so many things, and she could be very abrupt. She had another side too, though. Imogen's dual personality is evident in her many stylistic photographs of plant species, still lives in industrial landscapes." Imogen Cunningham was an American photographer whose intimate portraits and floral still lifes are characterized by their evocative light and attention to detail. Cunningham's photographic work runs the gamut from expressively lighted shots of flowers to piercing portraiture shot on commission, to mysterious street photography, to experimental abstractions. She was once considered one of the greatest photographers, alongside her contemporaries Alfred Stieglitz and Ansel Adams. And during the 1960s and 70s, at the height of the women's liberation movement, many recognized her important contributions as blazing a trail for women who wanted to take up the medium. Along with Adams and Weston, she was one of the most high-profile members of the group F64, one of the most famous photography collectives of all time. By the time she was 90, Cunningham was considered an iconic artist in feminist circles. In our photographs, a close-up view of a rubber plant reveals Imogen Cunningham's fascination with organic forms. Light reflecting off the leaves highlights the crisp lines and detailed texture of the plant and contrasts with the dark background to create a sharply focused modern composition. Cunningham often chose plants as a subject at the beginning of her long career. She explained, "The reason I really turned to plants was because I couldn't get out of my own backyard when my children were small. That was when I started photographing what I had in my garden." Sonia Nuskowiak was born in Leipzig, Germany, and at age 19 moved to San Francisco, where she met Edward Weston, the famed photographer. From 1929 to 35, they had a close personal and professional relationship. She lived with him as a companion, model, and mother to his children. He offered her artistic and technical expertise and shared in the enthusiasm of her first successes. He inspired Nuskowiak to notice the visual potential of her surroundings and taught her the rudiments of interpreting them with a camera. Nuskowiak was attracted to bold feats of urban engineering, the giant pythons of city bridges, curving highways, and massive water tanks, and underscored the power of these structures, both physical and visual, with her aesthetic approach. She also fixed her lens on the recurring patterns of nature. Like Weston, She concentrated on discrete objects photographed at close range, the inside of a flower, the veins of a plant, the lined surface of a rock. The effect was to magnify an abstract nature. Critical attention came early for her. By the middle 1930s, her work appeared in the De Young Museum and in several galleries. When Nuskowiak's relationship with Weston broke apart in 1935, she moved back to San Francisco, where she established a studio and was one of 8 photographers hired for the California region of the Federal Art Project, a division of the Works Progress Administration from 1936 to 1937. By the mid-30s, she was photographing in a new way, replacing her intimate studies of nature with far more expressive and distant views of rural and urban landscapes and many portraits of people that captured the imagination. Nuskowiak no longer perceived the land in strictly aesthetic terms, but as a place where people lived and worked. She became increasingly inclusive and specific, using the camera to describe and document rather than fragment her surroundings. Fascinated by New York City and the changes that had occurred in it during her life, her time living in Paris, Bernice Abbott began the monumental work of documenting its visual presence, its sweeping technological innovations, its bridges, its canyon-like streets overtowered by skyscrapers. And many of those were under construction at that time. She looked at brownstones and even early vestiges of colonial architecture, littered streets, the hum and vitality of New York, its sparkling transformation at night into a fairyland of light and glitter. The right artist and the right project had met. Her efforts were rewarded in 1935 when the New Deal's federal art project of the Works Progress Administration that we talked about before agreed to sponsor her documentation of New York under the project title, Changing New York. The book of the same title, published in 1939, was a milestone in the history of photography. For the rest of her life, Abbott advocated for a documentary style of photography as exemplified in this project. Yet her photographs of both the 20s and 30s provide us with more than a souvenir, more than a record or document. She demonstrated the medium's complexity through her direct approach toward her subject matter and how photography could be used as both realistic document and modern photographic art. In this way, Abbott served as a forerunner for future generations of photographers and contemporary artists who continue to push the boundaries of the medium. Helen Lovett has been described as maybe the most celebrated and least known photographer of her time. That was in 1997, when Lovett was 84 years old and the subject of a retrospective at the International Center of Photography in New York, the city where she was born and made most of her work. There had been this notion that Lovett's photography, that her photographs are lyrical and poetic, words that are too often applied to the work of female photographers. The truth is that Lovett was part of a highly intellectual and cultural political milieu in New York in the 1930s. The world she observed for most of that time was definitely local, Manhattan's Lower East Side, the Bronx, and Spanish Harlem, and yet recognizably universal in its capturing of the rhythm and gestures of children's play and adult social interactions or solitary reveries. It is a dramatically different world to our own, the city streets teeming with children who play with reckless abandon on stoops, waste grounds, and vacant buildings. In her pictures, you sense a tender quality of contact between her and her subjects. As her style matured, her photographs of children almost seemed choreographed in their capturing of the gestures and glances of play, and though often joyous, they frequently have a darker undertone. The children engage in combat games and pose as gangsters in homage to the Hollywood films of the time. For all of that, Lovett was an intensely private individual who gave very few interviews in her lifetime. We know that she lived alone in her New York apartment with a cat called Binky, and that she suffered from Meniere's disease, which causes hearing problems and dizziness. In old age, she said, perhaps only half jokingly, I've always felt wobbly my whole life. She was and remains a quiet genius of 20th century photography. Unlike most people who go through life dreading that they'll have a traumatic experience, the people that interested Diane Arbus were born with trauma. They've already passed their test in life. And this is how Arbus explained her attraction to carnival entertainers and people of unusually large or small stature, nudists, those with developmental disabilities, drag performers, and many others who appear regularly in her portraits. Arbus's interest in the experiences of people across the social spectrum may have emerged from her own childhood. She grew up in a wealthy family and felt shielded from the effects of the Great Depression. This experience of privilege was distressing to her. She said it was like being a princess in some loathsome movie, and the kingdom was so humiliating. Perhaps because Arbus believed that she'd not been sufficiently tested by adversity, she sought it out in the world around her. This personal investment in her chosen subject matter, however, did not lead Arbus to editorialize or make judgments. For me, she said, the subject of the picture is always more important than the picture itself, and much more complicated. Arbus betrays a sympathy, almost an affection for the imperfections and frailties of society. Sadly, in 1971, Arbus took her own life. Her photographs, however, continued to exert a powerful influence for Arbus' restless attraction to the unfamiliar and her refusal to offer judgment or easy answers. As Arbus herself famously put it, a photograph is a secret about a secret. The more it tells you, the less you know. Phillip Becker was a German artist born in 1931, one half of a photography duo with her husband, Bernard Becker. For 40 years, they photographed disappearing industrial architecture around Europe and North America. Bernard originally studied painting and then typography, whereas Hilla had trained as a commercial photographer. After 2 years of collaborating together, they married. Their work had a documentary style, as their images were always taken in black and white. Their photographs of industrial structures include water towers, coal bunkers, gas tanks, and factories, and they never included people. They exhibited their work in sets, grouping of several photographs of the same type of structure. They were well known for presenting their images in kind of a grid formation like you see here. Hilla said, we photograph water towers and furnaces because they're honest, they're functional, and they reflect what they do. And that's what we liked. This series presents a variety of blast furnaces photographed in American cities such as Baltimore, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Sensitive to the slight physical variations evident in each of these structures, Bernard and Hilla Becker composed these images by carefully selecting an elevated ideal viewpoint and placing each furnace at the center. By isolating their subjects and printing them in uniform size, the Beckers highlights the sculptural qualities of the furnaces. Together, the photographs invite careful, almost scientific observation of the differences between these structures, all built for the same purpose, the production of industrial metals. The photographs are portraits of our history. You are looking at a lost world. And when the structures have been demolished or grassed over as though they were never there, the pictures remain. Cindy Sherman is perhaps one of the photographers whose name you would have recognized. She's one of the best known and most important photographers working today. Her decades-long practice of photographing herself under different guises has produced many of contemporary art's most iconic and influential images. She metamorphosized into complex characters and shoots herself within equally involved scenes. At the heart of Sherman's work is the multitude of identity stereotypes, such as the unhappy housewife, the jilted lover, and the vulnerable naif. Acting as the director, photographer, and subject of this photograph, Cindy Sherman appears scantily clad in a pose suggestive of a centerfold model. But upon closer inspection, we become aware that the model kind of looks disheveled. Her lipstick is smeared, and her nightgown, which is only a simple cotton shift, is tattered and worn. It is her facial expression, though, seemingly full of pent-up sadness, that is the most unsettling. Sherman is a master of disguises, using costume, lighting, and makeup to evoke female stereotypes drawn from popular culture. One of the most important and influential artists of her generation, Nan Golden, has revolutionized the art of photography through her frank and deeply personal portraiture. Over the last 45 years, Golden has created some of the most indelible images of the 20th and 21st centuries. Since the early 1970s, her work has explored notions of gender and definitions of normality by documenting her life and the lives of friends who surround her. Golden gives a voice and a visibility to her communities. She is known for her deeply personal and candid portraiture. Golden's intimate images act as a visual autobiography, documenting herself and those closest to her, especially in the LGBTQ community and the heroin-addicted subculture. In 2017, the artist founded the group PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, which addresses the crisis of the ongoing drug war by targeting the pharmaceutical companies that have profited off the addictions and deaths of over 500,000 Americans. PAIN advocates for harm reduction, decriminalization of drugs, and life-saving treatments for drug users. She said, "For me, it is not a detachment to take a picture. It's a way of touching somebody. It's a caress. I think you have to actually give people access to their own soul." Known for her meticulously composed large-scale color images of architectural interiors, Hoffer's oeuvre explores the structure, presentation, and influence of space. Interested in the psychological impact of design and the contrast between a room's intended and actual use, Hoffer has focused her lens on cultural and institutional buildings, such as libraries, hotels, museums, concert halls, and palaces. While devoid of people, the images allow us to consider the role of their missing inhabitants. The large-scale nature of the work invites the viewer to linger over the architectural details and contemplate the subtle shifts in light that make the character of the space. On her decision to exclude people from her photographs, Hoffer said, "It became apparent to me that what people do in these spaces and what these spaces do to them is clearer when no one is present, just as an absent guest is often the subject of a conversation. The loud silence that is imagined by virtue of the absence of human interference offers the objects in the room an opportunity to project their own voices." Tina Barney photographs wealthy families in their homes and work environments, as seen in this striking example. Using a large-scale format camera and studio lights, Barney waits for a resonant moment in the interaction between her subjects and then asks them to hold their position. The result is an interesting blend of document and artistic arrangement. In this image of an Italian aristocrat and his two sons, power seems to be a central theme. We are keenly aware of the father's dominant role through his positioning in the picture and the objects at his elbow. The sumptuous interior and the suave posture of his two sons in the background creates a narrative that feels familiar, as if we're watching a family drama play out. More than mere documents of a particular way of life, Barney's images are also psychological portraits that explore the roles people play and the relationships between them. There's something up here on my computer. There we go. Nikki S. Lee is a contemporary Korean artist best known for her identity-shifting photographs, and the videos of American subcultures are very important to her. Often shot with disposable cameras by passerbys, Lee's most recognizable photographs, including her Hispanic project, are self-portraits, reminiscent of those by Cindy Sherman, who we just saw a little bit earlier. Dressed and made up in different outfits, Lee posed herself as a punk, a yuppie, a Hispanic woman, or a Black hip hop star. You don't want to carry big things. She said that she didn't want to carry big things around with her. She said, I'm lazy. The snapshot camera, you just carry it around and you take a picture, the artist said of her process. You don't need to think about anything. People in the street are not going to wait for you to set up a big camera. They would freak out. With a snapshot camera, they're comfortable. She would appear with them in casual group snapshots taken by friends or passerbys. The amateur point and shoot images reinforce Lee's attempt at verisimilitude. Lee would spend up to several months observing various groups and a few weeks posing with them. The artist Nikki Lee seemed to be everywhere and everyone in the late 90s and early 2000s. In today's political climate, artwork addressing identity has assumed a new weight. Cultural property and appropriation have become heated topics of debate. Lee has always used appropriation strategically to explore issues related to race, gender, roles, and sexuality. Lee's work gives viewers much to unpack. Lee put herself, or some version of herself, into her pictures. She said, essentially, life itself is a performance. When we change our clothes or alter our appearances, the real act is the transformation of our way of expression, the outward expression of our psyche. Growing up on the Crow Reservation in Montana, Wendy Redstar was immersed in Crow culture and art. Her father was a rock musician, her uncle was a painter, and her grandmother sewed traditional Crow regalia and beadwork. When reflecting on her childhood, Redstar said that although the reservation may have been poor economically, culturally, she grew up very rich. In this 4-part photographic work, Wendy Redstar pokes fun at romantic idealizations of American Indians as one with nature. She depicts herself dressed in traditional Crow regalia in 4 majestic landscapes, one for each season. Inflatable animals, plastic flowers, astroturf, and other artificial materials reference the dioramas of Native peoples often seen in natural history museums. Redstar uses the mass-produced materials to challenge the dominant perception of Indigenous cultures and art. There's a whole notion of being authentic, Redstar said. Your art is supposed to look like the 19th century, like we're a dead culture that never evolved. I'm dealing with really heavy topics here, pertaining to Crow and Native culture and the colonization of people. You can be very heavy-handed about it, but people don't want to be around that. You can find a way in by using humor. Humor or wit can be healing. By getting viewers to crack a smile or laugh, I can get them in. That way, they can investigate my work further. Mickalene Thomas creates vibrant portraits and detailed interiors that examine how the representation of women in popular culture informs our definition of femininity. In this photograph, Mickalene Thomas captured the strength of the woman's gaze, her halo of dark hair and her made-up lips. The vibrant patterns of her dress and the wall textile complement her features. The model Din was a medical student who regularly posed for Thomas. Yet the portrait depicts a character created by the artist through her staging of the setting and costume. Thomas's title, French for Din, a very beautiful Black woman, acknowledges an earlier era with its use of the historically charged term negress. In particular, Thomas references images of Black beauty found in popular media. Her backgrounds are decorated with vintage patterned fabrics and objects that loosely suggest the 1970s of her childhood, although she states that she does not aim to represent a specific time context. There are so many more photographers we could include, but because of our time restraints, let me just highlight a few more. Joni Sternbach is an American photographer whose large format camera images are particularly notable for highlighting women surfers and surf culture and for the environment around them. Daniella Rozelle is a Mexican photographer best known for her portraits of the privileged Mexican elite, of which she herself is a member. In these highly cultured environments, the female models blend in with the lavish objects, and Rozelle uses this composition to reemphasize the objectivity of women in photographs. The woman photographed here becomes synonymous with the object being sold. Rather than depicting the romanticized views of Mexican villages or the harsh images of the urban poor, Rozelle depicts the wealthy minority. Cara Romero, a contemporary photographer, member of the Southern Paiute in the Mojave Desert in California, is a passionate spokesperson for indigenous cultural environmental issues. Romero wants her photographs to create accurate modern representation by and for Native Americans. What people think Native Americans are is so far from the truth, she said. We've come through colonization with so many different and unique stories, and we live all kinds of different ways and ways of being. Romero aims to portray the variety of those identity stories because the more we can tell, the more we can avoid a one-story narrative. Laura Mcphee is noted for her large-scale photographs of landscapes and portraits of people who live and work in them. Mcphee's work is concentrated with place and the ways we define and manage our relationship to the land. This large-scale work is 3 feet by 6 feet and is absolutely stunning. Untitled number 2, St. Louis, is one of a series of photographs Catherine Opie shot in St. Louis. It presents an urban landscape with an array of buildings from different time periods and a mixture of architectural styles. The world of photography would simply not be the way we know it today without the work of these incredible female photographers. They help shape the artistic value of photography, whether it be by working on behalf of the government, collaborating on social projects, or bringing light to a worldly issue. The images captured by these phenomenal women clearly demonstrate their exceptional talent. And there's a whole lot more that we didn't have a chance to cover, because I wanted to have a little time to turn our attention to women printmakers. Now, my husband and I talk about why prints are awesome all the time. One key factor is that it takes planning and a lot of decision making to think through all the steps that you have to use to make a print, which slows the artist down and makes them consider every aspect of the proposed work. So there's an immediacy in a print that doesn't exist in a painting. You can almost see the artist's thought processes. Often in collaboration with technically proficient and market-savvy printers and publishers, artists have long been reimagining what a print can be. The inventive options an artist has to choose from today range from the handmade to the digital, from two-dimensional prints to books and multimedia projects, and women have been involved in them all. Printmaking has long been the vehicle to spread ideas, share messages, and start a conversation and effect a change. Before the modern day printer, printmaking was viewed, and still is, as an easy way to mass produce an image and message. This fits hand in hand with art related to activism and propaganda because of the opportunity to bring awareness to many people. While printmaking can incorporate many different styles, it's a powerful and versatile medium, allowing for a lot of different voices. So let's begin with one of our most assertive and provocative printmakers, Barbara Kruger. She writes with words on the walls, and then we read them, and that's it. That has been Barbara Kruger's laconic way of working for more than 40 years, and it's brought her international fame. Her art is argumentative and always directed straight at your face. Phrases appear over her photographs. The phrase, "I shop, therefore I am," is printed on a red and white calling card held by a black and white hand. "Your body is a battleground" runs across a woman's face, advertising an 80s pro-choice rally. "When I hear the word culture, I take out my checkbook" is emblazoned on a grinning ventriloquist dummy, a work that fulfilled its tart irony by changing hands in 2011 for almost $1 million. In her images with provocative text, she invites us to reconsider how we relate to one another and expose and undermine the power of dynamics of her identity, desire, and consumerism. Barbara Kruger is an artist who doesn't take life lying down, an agitator of the first order who isn't afraid to speak her mind. She has, over the last 25 years, developed an art practice that crosses all boundaries and breaks all codes. Image savvy and with a firsthand knowledge of how the media works from within, her striking combination of pictures and words reveal the stereotypes embedded in the hearts of image culture. From billboards to postcards, shopping bags to bus shelters, t-shirts, and even matchboxes, her photo text montages appropriate the language of commercial art to address the encroachment of power within our everyday lives. In other works of the early 1980s, fragmented body parts such as disembodied hands or hair were used to signify the fragmented female self. A dismantled doll is transformed into a signifier for a female construct, complete with added text that announces use only as directed. For there's no doubt that she means to keep you on the alert, not relaxing into peaceful contemplation. Her art forces itself upon you every time, and that's its graphic affront. O'Neill is known for monumental paintings and prints that she layers with unexpected materials to explore both deeply personal narratives and mythologies, as well as broader themes of racism and social justice. She was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1942 and grew up between Mississippi and Arkansas. As an undergraduate in Howard University, from which she earned a BFA in 1964, O'Neill became an active participant in the civil rights movement, joining in marches, protests, and voting drives across the country. Her titles are really interesting. One of them is "Racism is like rain. Either it's raining or it's gathering somewhere." Her work illustrates marginalized experience through abstraction. Heavy brushstrokes permeate, underscoring the omnipresent and unavoidable nature of racism. O'Neill's roots in activism, she was mentored by figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and James Baldwin during the 60s, are inextricably intertwined with her artwork. She examines the continuing influence of racism and celebrates the resilience of Black culture. They're not attitudes of despair. They just simply state a factual existence that continues today. Consequently, O'Neill's paintings carry a sense of optimism and joy despite the weight of their subject matter. This print is constructed of cut paper inked with colors that evoke a city skyline. Since her emergence in the early 1980s, Sharon Levine has been invested in questions of artistic originality, making copies of works by well-known 20th century male artists and claiming them as her own work. She's rephotographed, abstracted, and digitized images by famous male artists. Her groundbreaking approach has a healthy skepticism toward the concept of uniqueness. These prints are part of a series of woodcuts derived from canonical paintings by 4 early modernists: a mustachioed Mona Lisa by Marcel Duchamp, a cathedral facade by Claude Monet, a Berlin street by Ernst Kushner, and an abstract composition by Piet Mondrian. To make the prints, the artist photographed a reproduction of each work, scanned the photo, and reduced each digital file to 12 separate fields. In essence, Levine has merged 4 distinct artistic movements into a single synthetic style. These simplified images were used as the source material for woodcuts, eliminating any detail, brushwork, or distinguishing formal traits among the masterworks, transforming them into abstract variation. Those 12 colors end up as woodcuts, the oldest, least techno form of printing. I think it's really pretty cool. The title Banshee Pearls refers to ancient female spirits, the banshees of Gaelic folklore, whose high-pitched wails presaged a death in the family. Kiki Smith remembers her father calling her a banshee when she was a teenager, and she embraced the idea of herself as a death figure. Each of these 12 prints is composed of several photographic states of Smith's face that have been processed, altered, and recombined. Some have been re-photocopied until the subtleties of shadow are transformed into crude masks. Others have been blown up beyond recognition. In their repeated and tattered quality, the faces of Smith's prints become talismanic. Some faces have been photocopied and distorted so fully that the artist's features are barely recognizable. Others appear as ghosts. Smith's used dozens of self-portraits in different scales that are interspersed with skulls and masks and beast-like forms. She was intrigued by distortions of her own face, especially those that made her kind of horrific looking. She used childhood photographs, prints of her own hair, and impressions of her teeth pressed against the photocopier. The flowers and heraldic symbols on the plate introduce a counterpoint to beauty of the otherwise grotesque imagery. We talked about Kiki Smith as a sculptor last month, but her prints are just as impactful. Smith frequently creates images of the human body and its parts, both internal and external. The multiple images in repeated rectangular form of the sheet set up a rhythm that recalls such bodily rhythms as the pulse, the heartbeat, and menstrual cycle, all unseen but essential to life. The 12 prints of Banshee Pearls were intended to be seen together, but the artists encouraged rearranging the order and the overall format of the series. Born in Latvia, Selmans fled the country with her family at the start of World War II. They lived in refugee camps until immigrating to Indianapolis in 1948. Selmans went on to study painting in Indiana and soon became known for recording real-world events by black and white television and photography. Selman's mastery of gray tones was well suited to her later depictions of expansive natural phenomena, such as desert sand, ocean waves, starry skies, or spider webs. In these works, she laboriously translates photographic details into paintings, drawings, and prints. Despite their realism, the images relate to overall abstraction in the sense that they reject the pictorial conventions of depth and a single figure on a distinct background. From the early 1980s forward, Selman's focused on the constellations, moons, and oceans using these various techniques, a balance between the abstract and photorealism. Selman's intense monochromatic images of the night sky based on photographs focus on a small and individual marks in the context of vastness. Susan Point was born in British Columbia. Since birth, Susan has lived on a reservation in Vancouver, British Columbia. She grew up in a family that actively celebrated its cultural heritage. In 1983, Susan began blending colors, prompting some critics to reject her color techniques and materials as non-traditional. But in the 1990s, Susan Point began creating three-dimensional art in materials such as glass, bronze, concrete, polymers, stainless steel, and cast iron. Due to her willingness to explore new mediums and work on a large scale, Point has been awarded numerous public commissions, including building facades and large sculptures. Her large-scale work welcomed visitors to Vancouver International Airport, as well as public buildings and corporate developments on both sides of Canada-US borders. Throughout, however, her use of Coast Salish design vocabulary has remained constant. An artist mother, an ecologically sensitive woodsman father, and a childhood spent exploring the outdoors and planting trees in Virginia, these are early influences that are the underpinnings of Isabella Kirkland's abiding interest in art and natural science and the intersection between the two. Kirkland says, however, that it wasn't until the 90s that she married her artwork to her childhood interest in nature. During the next 2 decades, that marriage has resulted in sumptuous, richly detailed, and thematically linked paintings and prints that are stylistically reminiscent of 16th and 17th century Dutch print paintings. The nearly 700 plant and animal species depicted in Kirkland's elaborate work were meticulously researched, photographed, measured, and drawn from specimens viewed at natural history museums and from plant and animal samples from around the world. The portfolio features 2 categories of species, those that are extinct or in decline, and those that have either come back from the brink of extinction. All the plants and animals are carefully arranged in dense tableaus that recalls classical paintings of floral arrangements or dead game. Although the suite highlights the immense destructive and disruptive influence humans have had on the ecosystems, at least one of the paintings, back, showcases species that have been saved through careful husbandry, offering hope that human influence can sometimes be restorative. Anne Hamilton is a visual artist, internationally recognized for her large-scale multimedia installations, public projects, and performance collaborations. Carriage investigates the process of circulation, transmission, interpretation, appropriation, and understanding of texts. Here, cross-sections of multiple books were layered with spine glued to a cheesecloth. There was a cheesecloth backing to create a ring-shaped object or collar that retained language and references of a book while evoking other associations, say the wheel of life or a circle, which could imply many things at once: completeness, nothingness, the absolute, enlightenment with no beginning and no end. It goes on and on. Structurally, strings between the cheesecloth and spine provide a handle or a tie that mimic the way book fragments were constructed. The collar, made using the traditional materials of bookbinding, is housed in a transparent box that both protects and serves as its display case. I wanted to end this series with a look at one of our most impressive, newest and latest acquisition, Epigraph Dabascus by Julie Marito. It's monumental, almost 8 feet by 20 feet, a 6-part print that showcases her mastery of the medium, incorporating a variety of techniques. Architectural drawings of buildings located in Damascus, the capital of Syria, underlie the composition. Columns, arches, and porticos shown from multiple perspectives are among the many depicted architectural details of the war-torn city. Gestural marks are densely layered during the printing process, fragmenting the precise line work and underneath, partially obscuring the architectural elements contained within. The work's title and its disorienting alliteration of real places evoke the destruction of Damascus in the face of a brutal year-long war. Printmaking has long been an important part of Marito's oeuvre, precisely because it allows such radical experiments with the construction of images. The various processes allow Marito to take the many elements of the work, looking at them individually in a way impossible in painting or drawing. In Epigraph Damascus, Marito has developed a practice and vocabulary that has allowed her to build deep, dark density, combined with an effortless flow in a composition that goes far beyond traditional printmaking. One of the most recognized visual artists of our time, Julie Marito's works are a direct response to urgent political matters such as war, colonialism, diaspora, displacement, and social protest. There are thousands of females working as printmakers in the world, but this list highlights only just a few notable ones. These women were trailblazers who overcame barriers and created opportunities equivalent to those commonplace to their male counterparts. So we've seen that although women artists have been involved in the making of art throughout history, their work, when compared to that of their male counterparts, has been often obfuscated, overlooked, and undervalued, with many of their works wrongly attributed to male artists. The history of art has been forever considered written, published, and taught by men, primarily for a male audience. For women, the mere possibility of becoming an artist, to have access to necessary materials to produce, exhibit, and then against all odds, succeed and sustain the activity, has been an incessant and exhausting fight, physically, mentally, and psychologically. The women we have talked about in this series were the brave women who had the courage to defy all rules in order to pursue their vocation and carve out their place in the art world. It is still the case that very few women can make a living out of being a full-time artist. They are increasing in number. There are some very prominent female artists, but it's been a long, hard struggle. Things are changing, and this chicken or egg thing is being broken at last. Many great female artists tend to be forgotten in history. Those who've been neglected and marginalized for years or even centuries lately are regaining their place on museum walls. There is still a lot to be done in this matter, but maybe today is a good day to put a few of these great artists in the spotlight again. Museums are interested in art whose value lies in excellence. And more often than not, that art is made by women. So I thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you've enjoyed our look into women in art. I look forward to seeing you next month when we will begin another series focusing on African American art. So until then, stay safe. And does anybody have any questions or comments that you have?
I have a comment. It's Jessie Beal from 1904 World's Fair as a photographer, climbing huge ladders, giving us so much photography of the World's Fair. And we probably don't have anything in the art museum. I mean, Mr. Historical has the collection. The public library has turned the glass slides into digital. But Jessie Beal was really a forerunner in photography, climbing huge ladders to get photographs and such. And she gave us the view of the World's Fair. So I just wanted to add her to your list.
Oh, that's a good one. I don't think we have any of hers in our collection, but
yeah, but she's noted for really putting the World's Fair on the map for for St. Louis. So just most of our things are in the archives for people to have and see. The public library in the city has a huge, they have the big collection and they digitized it. So, but she was a phenomenal woman. And thanks, Dale. Good to see you again.
oh, good to see you too. Thanks for that information.
Yeah, so, okay.
Remember,
that was it.
I want to remind everybody that Dale has agreed to do another program beginning March 28th, and it's African American art. So you can email me, or you'll look for the e-blast that I send out and you can sign up. So we're looking forward to having you back, Dale. It was such a wonderful program. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Everybody have a good March. And we'll see you then.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.